They say Rome conquered with legions, iron, and fire. But the truth? Rome's real weapon wasn't the sword. It was bread. It was wine. It was grain carried over mountains and seas. Armies march on stomachs. And Rome? Rome mastered hunger. Rome's greatness did not begin with the clash of swords or the roar of triumph in the arena. It began here in the soil, with the silent turning of earth and the quiet count of sacks filled with grain. Before empires could be carved from conquest, men had to eat. And Rome understood from its earliest days that the surest path to power was not only through discipline and steel, but through stomachs kept full. The needs were enormous. A single legion of around 5,000 men demanded at least 3 pounds of grain per man every single day. That meant 15,000 pounds in just 24 hours. Stretch that over a week, and you have over 100,000 pounds for one legion. And Rome fielded not one legion but many, often campaigning far from the heart of Italy. These were not numbers to be guessed at. They were counted, measured, written down, and delivered with ruthless precision. This is why Rome thrived where others faltered. Rival tribes fought for plunder, feasting after victory, starving after defeat. But Rome planned for the long march. Rome built storehouses and filled them months in advance. Rome set aside rations before swords were drawn. They mastered not only the art of war, but the art of waiting. Battles could be lost and still the empire endured, because granaries were full and the people did not go hungry. Farmers in the Italian countryside tilled their fields not only for their own families, but for the city itself. Their wheat would be baked into bread that sustained workers building aqueducts, roads, and temples. Their harvest would travel by cart, mule, and barge to feed not just Rome's armies, but the swelling population within its walls. From these fields came the first promise of empire. Rome would not starve, and therefore Rome would not fall. Consider the rhythm of a Roman year. Harvest in summer, storage in autumn, distribution in winter, campaigning in spring. Every season tied to grain, every victory tied to the harvest. Without this rhythm, there could be no expansion, no legions marching across Europe, no fleets sailing for distant shores. And so, Rome's story begins not in a general's tent or a senate chamber, but in the patience of preparation, in the quiet strength of farmers who may never have seen the front lines, but whose toil allowed the front lines to exist at all. It was not glorious, but it was essential. When Rome marched, it marched with bread as surely as with steel. The empire's foundation was not marble, but grain, and in this Rome revealed its first secret: that victory is not seized in a moment of battle, but sustained across countless days of hunger endured or defeated. It was here in the hidden foundation of food that the empire's destiny was first secured. Grain may have been harvested in the fields, but it was the city where its value became clear. Rome was not just any city. It was the beating heart of the empire, swollen with 1,000,000 souls at its height. 1,000,000 mouths meant 1,000,000 meals, and to keep that many people fed required more than scattered farms. It required an organized system, a logistical machine that worked without pause. At the center of the system was the annona, the state-managed grain supply. Citizens knew that bread was not a luxury, but a right. Each month, thousands of people lined up to collect their ration of wheat. Roughly 150,000 citizens were eligible to receive this dole. For many, it meant survival. Rome had transformed food into politics, bread into loyalty. Keep the stomach full and the citizen remains calm. Let the stomach go empty, and rebellion brews faster than any enemy at the gates. The supply chain stretched like veins through the empire. Grain came first from Italy, but as the population grew, Italy could no longer feed itself alone. Rome looked outward, seizing fertile provinces. Sicily was an early breadbasket. Later, North Africa became critical. But it was Egypt, after the conquest by Augustus, that became the jewel. Its Nile floods produced harvests that dwarfed those of Italy, feeding not only its own people but Rome as well. By the 1st century AD, Rome depended on Egyptian grain shipments like blood to its heart. The journey was monumental. Grain would be loaded onto massive ships, each capable of carrying hundreds of tons. These fleets crossed the Mediterranean, escorted by warships to ward off pirates. At Ostia, Rome's great port, warehouses known as Horaea swallowed up the shipments. From there, the Tiber carried the grain inland. Barges floated the cargo to the very edge of the city, where it was distributed. Every sack had to be accounted for, every measure checked. Mistakes meant hunger. Inside Rome, the scale was astonishing. Bakers worked day and night, grinding wheat into flour, kneading dough, feeding the ovens. Their work filled the streets with the smell of fresh bread, a scent that meant security. It was bread that united classes, bread that softened tensions. Even the emperors knew this. Bread and circuses the people demanded, and the emperors delivered. Public entertainment distracted the mind, but bread silenced the belly. Without it, power crumbled. There were risks everywhere. A storm could sink ships. A delay at sea could leave markets bare. Riots sometimes broke out when grain shipments failed to arrive. Emperors understood this threat deeply. Securing the grain supply became not just an economic concern, but a matter of state security. Armies were dispatched to guard trade routes, fleets patrolled the seas, and generals planned campaigns around protecting harvests. Food was not passive, it was power. Control the grain and you control the people. Disrupt the grain and you weaken the empire. This was Rome's second great lesson, that the empire's strength was not only in conquering land but in feeding it afterward. The glory of Rome's marble and gold rested on something far more humble: sacks of grain, hauled across seas, stored in dusty warehouses, and handed out to citizens in measured shares. Rome's armies marched abroad, but its survival at home depended on these flows of food. And that invisible war, the war against hunger, was fought every single day. When Rome's armies moved, they did not march alone. Behind every spear, every shield, trailed an invisible army of cooks, quartermasters, mule drivers, and grain carriers. Logistics was not an afterthought. It was the lifeline of conquest. And here, on the long road stretching from the Alps to the deserts, the empire revealed its greatest discipline: feeding the machine of war. Each legionary carried a ration pack, often enough grain for 2 weeks. Wheat was the staple, hardy, reliable, compact. Soldiers would grind it themselves on small hand mills, bake flatbreads, and boil porridge in iron pots. It was monotonous, but it sustained them. Meat was rare. Wine was rationed. Variety was scarce. The food was not about pleasure, but endurance. Hunger was the true enemy, and Rome had learned long ago that a hungry soldier was a broken soldier. But no legion could rely on carried rations forever. Campaigns lasted months, even years. This is why Rome built a system of supply lines that stretched like arteries into the frontier. Grain convoys moved behind the marching columns. Wagons creaked under the weight of sacks. Pack animals strained against the load. When possible, the army lived off the land, seizing food from enemies or requisitioning it from allies. Yet Rome preferred planning to chance. They mapped routes, calculated distances, and established depots along the way. Every mile marched was measured against the grain it consumed. Consider the sheer mathematics. One legion of 5,000 men needed about 60,000 pounds of grain every month. Add cavalry, servants, and animals, and the number grew even larger. Multiply this by several legions campaigning together, and the figures swelled into staggering sums. Without organization, such demand would have crushed any army. With it, Rome became unstoppable. The roads themselves became allies. The famed Roman roads were not only for speed of troops, but for the steady flow of wagons. Stones laid with precision, drainage ditches cut along the sides, mile markers set to guide the march. Along these routes, soldiers could move supplies faster than any rival. Grain could travel hundreds of miles without spoiling, ensuring that armies deep in enemy territory still received their daily bread. And yet it was never easy. Soldiers felt the grind of routine, grinding grain by hand, chewing the same bread day after day, drinking thin wine or water. Some grew homesick for the flavors of Italy, for olives, cheese, or fruits. Others endured fatigue, carrying not only their weapons but also millstones, pots, and grain sacks. The monotony was crushing, and that monotony was itself an adversary. Here lies the hidden conflict of Roman war. The enemy was not only Carthaginian or Germanic, it was hunger, distance, exhaustion. Victory depended not just on the clash of spears, but on the endurance of men eating the same hard bread for the 1,000th time, marching step after step with no end in sight. This was Rome's third lesson, that armies are not held together only by discipline or courage, but by food. Every conquest, every frontier gained, every battle won, was decided first in the kitchens, the storehouses, and the humble sacks of wheat carried on mules. Rome conquered with legions, but it sustained them with grain. Without food, the mightiest army would crumble. With it, Rome marched on. If Rome's roads fed its armies, the seas fed the city itself. Grain convoys across the Mediterranean were the arteries of empire, moving lifeblood from Africa and Egypt straight into the heart of Rome. Without these fleets, the city of 1,000,000 would have starved. Every loaf of bread eaten in the forum, every ration handed to a citizen, was tied to ships braving uncertain waters. The Mediterranean was Rome's stage, and on it, food became both prize and vulnerability. Vast cargo ships called navis honoraria carried up to 400 tons of grain. Their hulls were deep, their sails wide, their journeys slow. They relied on steady winds, calm waters, and good fortune. But the seas were treacherous. Storms could dash ships against rocks, pirates could strike at isolated convoys, and delays could ignite riots back in Rome. Food at sea was as fragile as it was vital. To guard against this, Rome turned logistics into naval strategy. Fleets of warships shadowed the grain convoys. Patrols combed the waters for pirates. Harbors like Ostia and Portus were fortified with warehouses, lighthouses, and long quays designed to unload as quickly as possible. Even the emperors took personal responsibility. Augustus created the position of Praefectus Annani, an official tasked with overseeing the grain supply from harvest to harbor. It was a role as powerful as any general, for it determined whether Rome starved or thrived. North Africa became the empire's breadbasket, its fertile plains yielding endless harvests of wheat. But it was Egypt, conquered after the fall of Cleopatra, that became indispensable. The Nile's predictable floods brought bumper crops year after year. Rome consumed nearly half of Egypt's grain. To lose those shipments meant famine. And so, emperors guarded Egypt jealously, knowing that control of the Nile meant control of Rome itself. Imagine the scale. Hundreds of ships sailing season after season, thousands of sailors, dock workers, and officials involved in the process. From the harvest on the Nile to the baker in Rome, the grain might change hands dozens of times. But the rhythm was constant: cut, load, ship, store, bake. An endless cycle repeated year after year, feeding an empire that seemed insatiable, and the risks never ceased. In AD 19, when shipments were delayed, riots broke out in the capital. The Emperor Tiberius himself was nearly attacked in the streets, blamed for empty markets. The message was clear. No matter how strong Rome's legions or how tall its monuments, grain shortages threatened its very survival. Bread was not optional, it was Rome's pulse. The seas themselves became part of Rome's character. Control of the Mediterranean, what the Romans proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea, was not only about territory, but about supply. To rule the sea was to rule the stomachs of the people. Every time a Roman baker pulled loaves from his oven, it was proof that the empire's fleets had prevailed against nature and man alike. This was Rome's fourth lesson. Food could not be separated from strategy. Ships were as vital as soldiers. Ports were as critical as fortresses. And the quiet work of sailors and dock workers mattered as much as the triumphs of emperors. Grain on the water was victory in motion, an invisible battle fought in silence, wind, and waves. The empire's greatness depended on the sea, and every loaf eaten in Rome was a reminder of this fragile, constant war. Evening in a Roman camp was not filled with glory. It was filled with routine. Soldiers, weary from marching, dropped their packs, set up their tents, and went straight to the most pressing task: food. Every day was the same. Every meal was the same. Grain ground into flour, flour turned into dough, dough baked into bread or boiled into porridge. Repetition, endless and unchanging. This was the true battle Rome's legions fought, not only against enemies with swords but against hunger, boredom, and fatigue. Imagine thousands of men crouched by campfires, bending over millstones, grinding in silence. The sound of stone on stone echoed across the camp, as if the army itself was a single great machine, grinding forward through monotony. Bread was sustenance. Bread was survival. But bread was also the weight of routine pressing down on every man. Soldiers carried their own rations, often up to 2 weeks of grain. They baked flat loaves, heavy and coarse, or stirred mush into iron pots. Salt, when available, gave flavor. Wine was watered down, rationed carefully. Meat was rare, a gift when it came. The diet kept men alive, but it drained the spirit. A legionary might dream of olives, fruits, or cheese, but the reality was always the same. Bread and porridge, porridge and bread. Homesickness crept in during these meals. Around the fire, men spoke of families left behind, of vineyards and farms in Italy, of markets where spices and fish could once be bought. Food was not only fuel, it was memory, and memory sharpened the ache of distance. The empire's strength demanded sacrifice, but the sacrifice was not only blood on the battlefield. It was years of routine, endured mouthful by mouthful. Discipline enforced the monotony. Officers inspected supplies, checked rations, and punished theft. The rhythm of grinding, baking, and eating was part of military order. Soldiers understood that without it, the Legion could not function. The food was plain, but it bound them together. Each man shared the same bread, the same porridge, the same hunger. Routine forged unity as surely as training did. But monotony carried danger. An enemy could be faced with courage, but repetition wore men down in ways swords could not. Exhaustion grew heavier with each identical meal. Fatigue blurred the days. Hunger gnawed at the edges when supplies ran short, turning routine into suffering. And yet the legions marched on. They endured. Because Rome had built them not only to fight battles, but to withstand the crushing weight of routine. The enemy was not always Hannibal or the Gauls. The enemy was the grind. The daily, ceaseless demand to keep eating the same, to keep moving forward, to keep working when the body longed to rest. Rome's soldiers fought monotony with discipline, fought fatigue with obedience, fought hunger with bread. Victory was not only in battle, it was in the patience to endure. This was Rome's fifth lesson, that war was not won in bursts of glory, but in endless repetition. In the grind of meals, the weariness of routine, and the stubborn endurance of men who kept marching even when every step felt the same. Night fell, and with it came the longest hours. The legion slept in rows of leather tents, but not everyone closed their eyes. The night watch began. Quiet men at the edge of camp, staring into the dark, hands clutching spears, eyes fixed on the horizon. Time slowed. Silence pressed down. Every whisper of wind sounded like an enemy. Every snap of twigs could be danger. The soldier on watch shifted his weight, heavy with fatigue. His body longed for rest, but his duty forbade it. The watch was divided into shifts. Each man knew when his hour would come. The trumpet blast marked the change. Always the same. Always precise. Routine, even here. First watch. Second watch. Third watch. Fourth watch. The night was carved into discipline. And yet in the dark, doubts crept in. A soldier thought of home, of warm meals, of familiar voices. He gripped his weapon tighter. Was this worth it? Did Rome see him out here, standing against the cold and the emptiness? Or was he just another shadow in an endless war? Fatigue grew heavy. Eyes burned. The temptation to close them was strong. But punishment for sleep was death. The legion allowed no weakness. One man's lapse could cost the camp everything. So men endured. They walked in circles to stay awake. They whispered to themselves. They bit their tongues. Anything to hold the line against exhaustion. The night dragged on. The darkness seemed endless. No enemy appeared, yet tension never eased. The real battle was not against unseen foes. It was against the weight of time. Against the crushing monotony of waiting. Against the fear that tomorrow would be the same as today and the day after. And the day after. In the stillness, the camp spoke in fragments. The snore of a comrade. The hiss of embers. The soft creak of a tent rope in the wind. Tiny sounds became enormous. Each one a reminder of silence. Each one a reminder of duty. Sometimes alarms were real. A shout in the night. A shape moving beyond the torches. Men leapt awake, hands on swords. The heart raced, blood surged. And then, nothing. A stray animal, a shadow. The false alarm passed, leaving nerves frayed. Still, the guard returned to his post, knowing the true danger might come at any moment. This was the hardest war of all. The war against the hours of waiting. Against loneliness, against fear, against the ache of a body that longed for rest and the mind that refused to yield. The legion's strength was not in its weapons alone, but in this discipline. Men who kept watch when every instinct screamed to stop. The night stretched until dawn. When the first light touched the sky, relief swept over the camp. Trumpets called. The routine began again. Fires relit. Bread baked, packs strapped. The cycle resumed. The night had passed and the legion had endured. This was the hidden victory, not the clash of steel or the roar of battle, but the quiet endurance of men who stood their post through the long night. Rome survived not only through conquest, but through patience, through order, through the countless nameless guards who faced the dark and did not look away. Across 6 chapters, one truth has stood clear. Rome did not endure for centuries on force of arms alone. Its true victories were won in the quiet, in the endless repetition of duty, in the small acts that kept an army alive and moving. Food on the march, water in the desert, guard posts in the night. These were not grand moments meant for statues or poetry, yet they were the foundation that carried legions across continents. You have seen how the Roman soldier was not only a fighter but also a laborer, a builder, a watchman. His greatest enemy was not always the barbarian at the frontier, but the gnawing hunger in his belly, the exhaustion in his bones, the silence of the night. And still he endured. Because Rome demanded it, because Rome's survival depended on it. In every loaf of bread baked at dawn, in every ration divided with precision, in every tired guard who refused to sleep, Rome's empire was safeguarded. Logistics were not an afterthought. They were the empire's lifeline, its secret weapon. So when we remember Rome, we should not think only of emperors or marble monuments. We should remember the countless men who carried grain sacks instead of swords, who built roads before battles, who held the line against hunger, fatigue, and time itself. Their struggle was quieter but no less decisive. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson. Power is not only measured in victories shouted on battlefields. It is measured in endurance, in patience, in order maintained when chaos lurks at the edge of the firelight. That is what made Rome more than an army, more than a city. It made Rome an empire. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.